All right, good evening and welcome to our live stream tonight. And thank you for those who are here at the service tonight. Glad to meet once again this Sunday. And once again, we're going to be in the book of Exodus tonight, book of Exodus, and going to be continuing looking at the life of Moses and just considering a few things. And trust that you had a great day. I have a new intern at the back running my live stream. So if anything goes wrong, make sure you thank Pastor for that. But it is definitely interesting times that we're living in and learning lots of new different things. And we do appreciate the opportunity that we have to do this online and meet once again. So tonight, Exodus chapter 2, and last time we were in chapter 2 as well. And we'll do a bit of a recap. But I'm going to be reading from verse 11 once again, kind of going over what we read last time, up until chapter 3, verse number 1. So a larger chunk here. But it's really, this passage that we're looking at this evening is a transitional period in Moses' life. And we're going to look at that. And really, this is a continuation. And if you study through the Old Testament and just everything pointing to Jesus Christ, and we see this God's great promise in this Abrahamic covenant that he had promised to Abraham to make of thee a great nation. And we just kind of see how things transition from Abraham and then God telling Jacob to go to Egypt, and how, it's kind of strange how God worked it that way, but God has a purpose for how he moved people into Egypt. And now they're in Egypt prospering, and so much that Pharaoh is oppressing the Hebrews. But as we've studied already, we see that Moses, by God's providence, has raised him up in the palace. And we think, well, this is perfect. God's trying to bring them out of Egypt once again. And here's Moses being raised in Pharaoh's palace, the prince of Egypt. But we see that God has a different plan, and he's going to work it out in his way rather than what we think might work in that way. So Exodus chapter 2, and starting at verse 11, the Bible says, "And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me, and thou killest as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known." And these are the verses we're going to focus on, verse 15 and onward. "Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, And where is he? Why is that ye have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter. And she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them." Now look at verse number 1 of chapter 3. "Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb." And before we go further tonight, let's open in a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so thankful that we get to meet once again and open your word. And I pray, Lord, that you speak to our hearts, Lord, that we learn from the life of Moses and how you use your vessels, Lord, in your way and for your purpose, Lord. And it might not be what we see on the outside, Lord, but what you see on the inside and how you plan to equip your people, Lord. And I pray that you would just work in our hearts. And Lord, I pray that we would be empty vessels willing to be used by you. And we pray these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen. So we read here how the Hebrews are being oppressed and Moses was grown. And we looked at the last time. He was fully grown. He was fully trained at that time. And he is called, and we see that in Acts. He felt a call on his heart to go out to see his brethren. He knew that these people, these Hebrews, were his brethren. He knew he wasn't of the house of Egypt. He was in his prime. He was ready. He went unto his brethren. He had chosen his people over the palace. We see throughout this passage and onward that Moses was a natural deliverer. He went out and saw the Egyptian smiting the Hebrew, and he slew him. And he delivered that person. And that wasn't just because it was an Egyptian over the Hebrew, but we see that even the next day he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting one with another. And he mediated between them. He was naturally trying to deliver people, help people out. We see that as he goes and he helps the priest's daughters, and he delivers them from the shepherds. He was a natural leader. He had royal training, and you think of the situation, and you think of God's promise, and you say, well, this is the man for the job. We look on the outward, and we say, this is so perfect. They're stuck in Egypt. They need to be delivered, and Moses is in the palace. He's a prince of Egypt. This is the perfect man for the job. He's in the right place at the right time. And, I think oftentimes we have this idea, we look at people and we say, man, God's going to use that person. They're so talented. They're so gifted. And that may be the case, but we don't know who God is going to choose and how God is going to use them. We tend to look on the outward because we can't see the heart. Wow, God's really going to use that person. And we base it upon our human standards and our ideas and what we can foresee how maybe God can use that person. But that's not how God would choose his people. We saw that as we went through the book of Genesis in the life of Joseph and his family. And, Joseph was the most unlikely. He was one of the younger brothers. And in his dream, he saw that one day his family would bow down to him. And we see that eventually happen. He delivered them. And that's interesting. By the Midianites, he entered Egypt. And we see now he is leaving, and Moses is leaving, and he's with a Midianite. But that's beside the point, just something I noticed. But Joseph delivered his people. Very unlikely. His family thought he was dead. He was sold into slavery. His father thought he was dead. This was true with David and his brothers and being anointed as king. In 1 Samuel 16, we see that as they go to find God's anointed, and says in verse 6 of Samuel 16, and it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. He goes to the eldest brother and he says, surely this is who God is going to use. It's just natural. You say, if God's going to choose a king, he's going to choose the eldest brother. He's going to choose what we look on the outside. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. We look on the outside and we say, look, man, that person is perfect for the job. But even the Lord said to Samuel, no, that is not, I have refused him. Don't even look at his height and stature. I look on the heart. And then eventually Samuel says unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. David wasn't even there. He was doing his job. He wasn't even considered because they assumed it would be the eldest, if not one of the elder brothers. that he wasn't even there. He was doing his job. He was working. And God said, that is him. Anoint him, for this is he. Listen, Moses, he was the man for the job, but God still had work to do on him. There's more preparation. And we looked at last time that Moses' life can be broken up into 3 periods of 40 years. 40 years until he was grown. 40 years up to this point, and then we see the next 40 years, which we're going to focus on tonight, and then the 40 years as the leader of the children of Israel. But think about that, 40 years to this point, he was grown, and you think, well, wow, 40 years to start the work that God has planned for you. You know, God put it on his heart that he was to go out and to see his brethren and to see what was happening. But that's not what God had intended for his life yet. He still had more work to do. Moses fled to the desert of Midian for 40 years after he slew that Egyptian. 40 years in the palace, 40 years in the desert, and 40 years as the leader of Israel. And this passage here from verse 15 up till chapter 3, this spans 40 years. 40 years of him in the desert. And we see him, he goes and he delivers the daughter of Jethro, the 7 daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian, known as Ruel. And I find that funny. He has these 7 daughters, and he goes and he saves them and he helps them. And the daughters come home, and the dad says, why are you guys home so early? And they said, this man, he helped us, he watered. And he said, well, where is he? Why didn't you bring him home? You know, this man has 7 daughters, and he's trying to marry them off. And he says, you better go get him. So they go out and they bring Moses. And we see that he's married, and he has a son, and he has a new occupation. And all these things happen in this time, in this short passage, but it's really a span of 40 years. Acts 29, verse 30, it says, then fled Moses at the saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. And when 40 years were expired, there appeareth to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. So it doesn't state that here in Exodus, but if you read the account in Acts, we see that it was a 40-year time period. Listen, God was going to use Moses, but he still had work to do on Moses. You know, in our minds, we think, well, what perfect timing. He was fully grown, he's trained, he's ready. But God said, no, not yet. I'm not ready to use him yet. And I try to imagine how Moses must have felt. As he goes out, he's fully trained, and he's ready, and he knows these are his people, and he sees what's happening. And he knows that God is going to use him, and he feels ready. And he has to flee now. He runs away from Egypt where his people are. And I feel like maybe he thought he was a failure, and maybe he said, man, I messed things up. I shouldn't have done that. And now I'm not even where God needs me to be. But it was there exactly where God wanted him to be. It was his plan. And sometimes we feel in our lives like we've ruined things. We say, you know, how can God use me now after that? Or, you know, maybe you say, well, God didn't use me when I was younger, and now I'm later in life, and I'm in a different stage of life, and how can God use me now? And we kind of look to generations coming up and saying, well, that's their job, that's their task, that's their duty, but God is willing to use all of us no matter our age. Sometimes I think we look at other people, as I mentioned, we look on the outside, and I think we compare ourselves. It's so easy for us to compare ourselves. And we say, well, you know what? If I was like that person, oh man, God can use me in such a great way. Or if I could do that, God can use me in that way. If I could speak like that person, or I can preach like that preacher, or if I can sing like that person, or if I had the looks of that person, or whatever you compare yourself to, and you say, if only I had, if only I had, if only I had, God can use me. But that's not how it works. We measure ourselves against other people, and we think, maybe God can't use me. But we will see that is not how God chooses his vessel. And we even saw that previously as I looked at Joseph and at David. God looks at the heart, and he equips his people, and he uses people in an unlikely way so that he gets the glory. So here's Moses at this totally transitional time in his life, 40 years in the desert, waiting for God to use him to deliver his people. Think about that. If you read that in Exodus in chapter 2 here, and we look at what's happening to the children of Israel, the Hebrews, Egypt's tightening down. They're really gripping down and oppressing them and making their life hard because they don't want them to prosper. But we see that God's continuing to allow them to grow, and they push them harder and working them harder and making them find their own materials and increasing the quotas and all these things. And Moses is ready to help out, and now he's fled for 40 years. So you think about in 40 years, how much more they're being oppressed at this time and how tragic the things are happening to the children of Israel. But God still needed to work in Moses' life. And I want you to notice just a few things tonight very quickly, things that God used during this time to prepare Moses for his leadership over the Hebrew children. First of all, I want you to notice as he left to go to the desert, as he fled to go to the desert, he would have learned some life skills that would have helped him as he led the nation. First of all, he needed to get out of Egypt. He had chosen his people over the palace, but he still had Egypt in him. He was raised in the Egyptian palace. He was raised with Egyptian education and leadership skills. And we see in verse number 19, when the priest's daughters went back, they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. He still looked like an Egyptian, but that was not God's plan to use an Egyptian. God had to prepare him. He needed to get out of Egypt, and he had to learn some new things. He would spend 40 years in the desert. He would have learned the land. His father-in-law, who he would have got to know, would have helped him learn the land, help him to scope out where things were and to find water, things like that. He was learning life skills so that when one day they would be wandering in the wilderness, that God would be able to use those skills to lead his children. He learned hard work, working in the desert, taking care of the flocks. He would have been mentored by Jethro, the priest. Verse 21, it says, and Moses was content to dwell with the man. He had formed a bond with Jethro or Ruel, which some say that might have been his proper name or title. But Ruel means God's friend. He was known as God's friend. And here he was living with him, under his mentorship, learning from him, drawing closer to God. He would have grown in his relationship with the Lord during these 40 years. If Moses had come right out of the palace and stumbled across a burning bush, would he have been ready? I don't know. We can't answer that, but God used this time. It would have prepared his time during his time as he grew closer with the Lord to meet Jehovah at the burning bush. Moses had the training of Egyptians, but he needed godly training and wisdom, and he would have received that during this time from Jethro and just working and serving and working during this time. So he would learn life skills that would help him later on. He would need to learn patience. Listen, the reason that Moses had to flee was because he lacked patience. And we're going to see this later on in his ministry as well as he leads. But he had to learn patience. As he went out and he saw the Egyptian smiting the Hebrew, instead of, dealing with it in the right way and maybe going through the right channels and helping him out in the right way, what did he do? He looked left and right. He looked about, he killed him. He lashed out in emotion. Listen, for Moses to lead the children of Israel for 40 years as they wandered through the wilderness, listen, he was going to need patience, and God was going to have to teach him that. As he learned and he lived in the desert for 40 years, he was learning patience. He was going to learn humility. God needed to teach Moses humility. He lashed out. He used his hands. He did it his way rather than God's way. Moses was going to need to learn to do things God's way. As he went and he would go back eventually and he was going to lead his people, God's people, out of Egypt, it was going to have to be on God's term. It wasn't going to be a political thing where Moses returned, here's the prince of Egypt, and now he's going to go sit down with Pharaoh. No, it wasn't going to be that way. It wasn't going to be accredited to his status as a prince. It wasn't going to be because of his might or his strength. It was going to be because of God, and God would receive the glory. He was going to have to use patience and humility as he went before Pharaoh time after time and saying, let my people go. And he'd return. And he wasn't going to be able to lash out like he did before and slay the Egyptian. He was going to have to say, listen, God is going to do this. And he's going to have to bring on the plagues and things like that. It was going to be in God's time, God's way, to God's glory. So he went from a prince to a shepherd. And that was a big sign to show humility before Pharaoh. He wasn't going to be approaching as a prince. He was going to be approaching as a shepherd. And if you're to read in Genesis, the Egyptians, they despised shepherds. They didn't appreciate them. They didn't like them. In fact, if you're to read Genesis 46, verse number 34, it says, they shall say, and this is Joseph coaching his brothers of what to say to Pharaoh about raising cattle because they wanted the good land in Goshen. It says, that ye shall say, thy servant's trade hath been about cattle from our youth, even until now. But we, and also our fathers, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. Listen, God was going to change Moses from a prince to a shepherd, and God was going to use a shepherd to approach Pharaoh to let his people go. They were going to know it was only because of God that they were able to exit Egypt. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then am I strong. 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. God uses us when we're weakest because his strength is made known and he receives the glory. And that's what he was going to teach Moses in the desert as he steps down from the palace and he leaves and he goes and becomes a shepherd to serve and to give God the glory that God would work through him. So he learned life skills, he learned patience, he learned humility, and then he was going to learn leadership. God gave him a family. He was teaching him leadership through his family. God used his new occupation to teach him leadership as a shepherd. You know, he needed to learn to be patient, to have humility, and to lead. Listen, sheep aren't the smartest animal. They wander. They demand love and patience. And Moses was going to have to learn to lead a nation, millions out of the land, and to lead them, and to be able to guide and direct and to encourage and to keep them going. But he wasn't going to be able to do that as he left the palace and he was acting out in emotions and not ready for that. He needed to learn some serious skills to lead a nation in the wilderness. So God had much to prepare Moses for. He needed more time. He needed more training. And we look at the situation, and before we consider all this, we say, well, why did he have to leave for 40 years? It was perfect. He had the position. He had power. He had he was in the place. He had the ability to speak to Pharaoh, maybe the ability to try to convince him. But we see that God moves him from where he is to the desert to continue the work on him. And maybe he thought he failed God. And maybe today you look at your life and say, man, have I failed God? Can God still use me? But where does God have you today, and what is he preparing you for? You know, our theme for the year is redeeming the time. And here we are in approaching June, and we're still locked down. And you say, How am I supposed to redeem the time? Listen, how is God preparing you today? How is God trying to use you? What is he trying to teach you? What is he getting you ready for? What is he equipping you with? And maybe you say, well, God, can God really use me? I'm not gifted like that person. I can't speak like that person. I don't have the character of that person or the charisma of that person or that talent or whatever it is. But that's not what God's looking for. God is looking on the inward. He's looking for someone who's willing, someone who's a vessel, someone who's sanctified for his use, that God can get the glory from their life. God uses who will bring him glory, and God will equip those who he calls. So I'm going to finish off with this verse that I read already. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 27. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Listen, Moses was on the top. He was grown. He was fully trained. He was at the prime of his life, and God said, nope, I need to bring you to a different place in life. You need to be at a different point in life. I need to bring you down in your occupation and your status because I'm going to use the weak things of the world to confound the mighty. Listen, Moses was going up against the greatest power in the world, the greatest ruler in the world. And God wasn't going to let it be a victory of political power saying, well, the prince got his way with the Pharaoh. No, God was going to use a shepherd to go before the greatest power of the world to get his people out so that he would receive the glory. And listen, God wants to do a great work through all of us today, but we just need to be willing and let him use us because like Paul said, he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong because God can use us. And I hope that you will allow God to use you today. And I hope the study of Moses has been a help. And I know it's a short period in his life, but it's a 40-year period, which I think we often skip over and we say, well, we skip from Moses being born and killing the Egyptian to fleeing, and then we kind of skip quickly to him getting the call of God, but we need to realize there was a reason that God pulled him away for 40 years. And God can still use our life today, and God is using us every day, even when we don't know what's happening and what God might be using in our lives. God is always doing a work, and we need to be willing to allow him to change and to groom and prepare us for his work. So that is our latest on this series of Exodus. And the next 3 weeks, I'll continue to go through this, and as opportunities throughout the year, I'll continue to go through Exodus and this life of Moses, and I hope that'll be a blessing to you. So I trust you had a great day. Join us once again this week, Wednesday night for our Bible study. We'll continue where we were supposed to start off on this past Wednesday, like Pastor said. There was an internet outage in our area, and so this Wednesday we'll continue starting on Lesson 3. And if you haven't joined in, and maybe you kind of feel like, well, I wasn't there for Lesson 1, Lesson 2, you know what? Don't worry about that. Join us for Lesson 3. There's something you get from every lesson. It's going to be a verse by verse through the book of Philippians, so we look forward to continuing that. This Wednesday on Zoom, the email will go out with the login information. It's the same every time, so if you have that link or login, you can go ahead and join us on Wednesday night at 7. And then Pastor's podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he's currently going through the Old Testament survey, just a quick look, breakdown of the books of the Bible, so we look forward to that. And then devotional on Saturday, and then looking forward to Sunday again. And as Pastor mentioned this morning, we have our connection groups where we can meet with 10 people. If you'd like to join us, we've had several already in the past few weeks, and we look forward to having them again. So if you are interested in coming to the church, just sharing some time of testimony, time of the word, time of just encouraging one another. We'd love to have you, but you just have to message me, let us know, and then I can book you in. And then same for Sunday, if you'd like to join us, we were able to fit in 10 people Sunday morning and Sunday night. If you'd like to join us, don't worry about trying to save room for other people. There's lots of time, lots of Sundays that you can plan you for a later Sunday. So if you can't come one Sunday, we can book you for another time. But we do want to see your face. We want to have the opportunity to have people come through the door, so please take advantage of that, but just have to let us know about that. But I trust that you have a rest of the good day. rest of the day, and that you have a great week. Enjoy the rest of the long weekend, and we will see you next time. So take care. God bless.